Black Archivist uncovers secret past and teams up with his worst enemy to expose the truth. Charleston, South Carolina, 1954. The prestigious museum, standing at the crossroads of history and culture, dominates the streets with its grandeur, like a sentinel guarding the past. Inside its marble walls, the echoes of past eras, wars, revolutions, slavery, linger. The artifacts on display hold the breath of those who lived through these times, but behind the gleaming exhibits lurks a shadow, untold stories, forgotten lives long hidden from view. And among these shadows steps Lisa Wilson. At just 24 years old, Lisa is a black woman, slender, with a neat hairstyle and a quiet yet confident gaze. She's just finished college and, at last, landed her dream job as an archivist at this museum. Proud of her accomplishments, Lisa is eager to prove herself in the world of art and history, a world she's always dreamed of joining. Being recognized for her skills with archives and research by one of the most respected institutions in the city feels like a victory. But her expectations are quickly shattered. The Charleston Museum is not just a place to preserve treasures, it's a battleground of reputation and historical pride, a symbol of the Old South's power and traditions. Here Lisa is about to experience a harsh truth. Her skin, her black heritage, becomes a visible marker of everything she will have to fight against. From her very first day, Lisa feels the chill in the air as her colleagues' eyes watch her. Melissa Randolph, her senior colleague, a white woman in her 40s, with a quiet, almost imperceptible air of superiority, shows her displeasure openly. Lisa can tell that Melissa smiles, but it's a cold smile, the kind you'd give someone you don't see as your equal. Melissa often points out small errors in Lisa's work, though she never takes the time to mentor or help her. Lisa doesn't know exactly why Melissa acts this way, but instinctively she knows it's more than just professional misunderstandings. Meanwhile, George Murphy, the senior curator, doesn't even bother to mask his disdain. A white man in his 60s, his graying hair cut short, wearing a suit that's faded and worn, much like his worldview, George has been in charge of the museum for decades. His authority is unquestioned. He prefers to work with people of his own kind. And to him, Lisa, this young, dark-skinned outsider, is nothing but an obstacle. He treats her with open coldness. He never meets her eyes, and his voice is always just a touch colder when he speaks to her. Lisa begins to feel that her presence in the museum is an inconvenience to him. He avoids her when he can, and when he does interact with her, it's always with a palpable detachment. There are no outright confrontations, but the small gestures, the puzzled glances, and the fleeting remarks constantly remind Lisa that she doesn't belong here. It's not like in college, where she competed with her peers and earned respect. It's not like in her own neighborhood, where no one saw her as other. In the museum, she sees how deeply racism seeps into every facet of life. It hides in the subtle things, the looks, the dismissive gestures, the undercurrent of exclusion that everyone seems to ignore, but that Lisa feels every day. But Lisa refuses to give in. Despite everything, she remains determined. Her love for archaeology and history helps her shut out the prejudice. Yet the internal struggle grows, becoming a shadow inside her, increasingly visible even to her. On the outside, she remains calm and focused, but inside she's torn. How can she fit into a world that refuses to see her talent and ability because of the color of her skin? One day, while sifting through dusty, forgotten documents, Lisa stumbles upon something unexpected. Among the countless lists of artifacts and historical materials, she finds an ancient item, an intricately decorated bowl, worn with age but still recognizable by its pattern. This isn't just any artifact, it's something far more significant. Lisa feels almost instinctively that this piece is special. Its origin is tied to the history of black slaves, freed people, and others whose lives have been forgotten or deliberately concealed in the museum's archives. She knows that this artifact could not only change her perception of the museum, but could shift the very narrative the museum holds about history itself. Lisa is certain of one thing. This discovery could shake the very foundation of the museum. She begins to research its origins, but it doesn't go unnoticed. Her colleagues, especially George and Melissa, are growing wary of her inquiries. They start to avoid her even more, and Lisa senses that her pursuit of the truth could lead to conflict. George, in particular, begins to show open hostility, not just towards her actions, but towards her very existence as a black woman daring to uncover the past in a world where, according to him, she has no place. Lisa faces a daunting challenge. She's part of a world that not only refuses to accept her, but actively ignores her efforts. And her research may unearth long-buried, painful memories that the museum would rather keep hidden in the shadows. Lisa dove into her work with enthusiasm, despite the difficulties she faced in those early days at the Charleston Museum. Becoming an archivist at such a prestigious institution had always been her dream, a chance to prove herself and show her knowledge and skills. But with each passing day, it became more and more clear that her professional achievements, and even her very identity, were being filtered through the lens of racial stereotypes. Lisa knew she'd have to work twice as hard to earn respect and prove her worth, but nothing could have prepared her for what lay ahead. One of her first assignments was to sift through the archives of older collections stored in a forgotten corner of the museum. Surrounded by dusty boxes and yellow documents, Lisa spent her days lost in texts and records that reflected the stories of long-gone people. It wasn't just an archive, it was a memory of how the history of the museum had been shaped, a history that often erased or ignored the black roots of the local culture. One day, as she was processing materials for a temporary exhibit, her eye caught something unusual, an old box hidden in one of the dusty drawers. This wasn't just any box, it had a layer of dust on it, but its metal surface, covered in paper, stood out from everything else. Lisa carefully opened the box and found several ancient objects inside, a stone inscribed with mysterious symbols, along with a few brittle pages covered in fading handwriting. On one of the sheets was a drawing that looked strangely familiar. It was the image of an African figure, possibly one of the slaves brought to Charleston long ago. A wave of unease washed over Lisa. Her fingers trembled as she carefully examined the documents and artifacts. This item seemed tied to the history of slavery, maybe even to her own ancestors. But why had this artifact been buried in the back of the archive, hidden beneath layers of dust? And why hadn't it been cataloged in the museum's official records? She delved deeper into the materials, trying to make sense of what they could mean. Alone with the artifact, Lisa began to dig even further, not just into the documents, but into personal records, possibly forgotten remnants of the time when slavery was still part of life in South Carolina. She could easily have forgotten about going home. This mystery had consumed her. These papers held an answer, one that could shatter many assumptions about how Charleston's history had been written and who had written it. Meanwhile, life at the museum went on, but Lisa increasingly felt out of place among her colleagues. George Murphy, the elderly curator, ignored her as if her presence at the museum were a temporary mistake no one dared to correct. Melissa Randolph, the senior archivist, would occasionally make small talk with Lisa. But it wasn't friendly conversation. It was more like a performance of politeness, concealing unspoken doubts and dissatisfaction. But the moment Lisa uncovered that artifact, everything changed. This wasn't just a collection of objects. It was a personal encounter with history tied to her own heritage. The more she thought about it, the more she realized her place in the museum wasn't accidental. She felt like it was up to her to uncover the truths the museum had been trying to bury or forget. The artifact she found wasn't just valuable, it was cultural heritage, connected to the story of slaves and freedmen who fought for their freedom and recognition. It was more than just a relic for display. It was a piece of Black history that had been rediscovered in the museum's forgotten corners. Lisa realized that this object hadn't been lost by accident. Perhaps it was part of a larger system of avoidance, a system that didn't want to acknowledge the role Black people played in shaping Charleston's history. Her research led to a startling discovery. She came across a document detailing how the museum had concealed key aspects of the history of slavery, rewriting the truth in order to maintain good relations with the white residents of the city. This revelation put the museum's reputation, its collections, and even some of its staff members in jeopardy. At that moment, Lisa knew she had no choice but to continue. She had to uncover the truth, even if it cost her job. She felt that if she didn't act, the truth would remain hidden forever. She couldn't let the museum continue to lie, ignoring its roots. But when Lisa tried to share her findings with her colleagues, especially with George, she was met with a wall of silence. The old curator, with his dismissive look and tendency to disregard new ideas, immediately expressed his disapproval of her discovery. He seemed determined to avoid discussing the matter, as if it were a personal issue for the museum and its staff. Lisa could feel the tension building between them. More and more, she was not just met with cold stares, but also with veiled comments that questioned her right to be involved in the museum's most important matters. George avoided her gaze as though her discoveries were a direct threat to his authority and reputation. It stung, but Lisa wasn't going to back down. Now, a new choice lay before her. She could continue her research alone, risking the inevitable rejection and disdain, or to unravel the mystery, she'd have to work with George, the man who was part of the very system trying to suppress the truth. From the very start, Lisa felt out of place at the museum. She knew that her presence in such a prestigious institution wasn't just a career move, it was a challenge to the old ways. But she was determined, set on proving to everyone, including herself, that she belonged. Still, with each passing day, it became more apparent that her accomplishments and efforts were being viewed as foreign, almost unnatural, to most of the museum staff. This was especially true when it came to George Murphy, the senior curator who had long ruled over the museum, determined to keep his world, one of old white men in high positions, untouched. George's appearance left a clear impression. He was old, his once dark hair now nearly entirely gray, with deep wrinkles around his eyes that only highlighted his stern, almost stubborn gaze. He carried himself with a dignity that had become an impenetrable wall to anyone who might challenge his authority. George believed his decades of work at the museum gave him the right to decide who deserved a place in his world. A Black woman, no matter her credentials or abilities, was still an outsider in his eyes. He couldn't allow someone like her to even think she could be an expert in his ancient, refined domain. Every morning, Lisa came to work hoping that maybe today would be a little easier. But deep down, she knew that behind her idealistic view of the world and her colleagues was a harsh reality. As she walked through the museum halls where the displays of artifacts reflected the grandeur of white creators, her inner voice reminded her that her presence here was no accident. But George didn't waste a moment reminding Lisa that she simply didn't belong in this world, in this history. One day, as Lisa walked through the corridor, George approached her and curtly muttered, "Never forget who's in charge here." His words, delivered without malice, but with a pointed superiority, made Lisa feel the full weight of her position. The artifact Lisa had stumbled upon in the archives became a kind of breakthrough for her. She hadn't anticipated it to become such a catalyst. It turned out to be an ancient talisman, likely brought to Charleston during the slave trade, belonging to one of the African communities. This object was undoubtedly of cultural significance, and Lisa knew its origins and history might hold the key to uncovering the truth about the museum's past. Everything she had been doing lately was connected to finding that key, but to uncover this mystery, Lisa understood that she needed to work with George. This was a difficult decision, not only because George was the museum's most experienced curator and expert on the collections, but also because his attitude toward her was far from professional. Every time Lisa entered his office, he would glance up with a look that was both distant and cold, as though simply being in his space was a burden to him. Lisa began working with the documents related to the artifact, but George kept avoiding her, even shying away from casual conversation whenever possible. He was certain that her work wasn't deep enough, that her perspective was too limited, and that she simply couldn't understand the cultural context of the objects she was studying. Lisa found more and more connections between the museum and the history of black slaves. But every time she tried to share her findings with George, he would dismiss them. He didn't want to hear about how the museum could be seen in a different light. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was downright threatening. He felt that Lisa was questioning everything he had worked for, and that terrified him, for he had built his world on racial and social hierarchies for so long. One day when Lisa asked him to look over the documents again, he responded curtly, without meeting her eyes. "These stories aren't for your understanding. The museum's not the place for people like you." His words weren't an outright insult, but they carried a lethal weight, as if Lisa had been undeservingly wronged and stripped of her right to be there. These moments began to accumulate in her soul. With each such encounter, Lisa's resolve to fight the system grew stronger. She could have given in and perhaps taken a quieter path, but her inner sense of justice wouldn't let her ignore this any longer. She decided that even if George never acknowledged her worth, she had to continue her search and uncover the truth. Her relationships with the other colleagues were no less strained. Melissa Randolph, the senior archivist, exhibited a certain caution when interacting with Lisa. Although she didn't openly display racism, her cold politeness and indirect remarks created an atmosphere of alienation. Lisa sensed that her presence in the workplace made others uncomfortable, even if they didn't show it openly. Even when Melissa tried to engage in conversation, her words always felt forced, like a strained smile when she said, "You must have learned a lot in college, but here at the museum, we do things differently." But Lisa wasn't alone in her quest to unravel the mysteries of the museum. She had already come to realize that this wasn't just a personal mission, it was a bigger one. It was about uncovering a history that had been hidden and ignored. Her struggle with George had become a symbol of this fight, a fight for the truth that could potentially turn the entire museum's story upside down. Lisa stood in her new office, surrounded by towering shelves of filing cabinets and piles of papers, some yellowing with age. No matter how long she stared at these endless documents, they remained a mystery to her, much like most things in this cold world of the museum. The museum, this place where history was made, where the past was put on display, did so only to hide the real truth, like a piece of artwork coated in a thick layer of varnish. Her hands kept moving, rifling through paper after paper, but her thoughts, just like her actions, were shackled by the system, holding her back from moving forward. George Murphy walked into her office. His old, stocky body strained under the weight of his suit, and his perpetually disdainful face gave off the impression that he was the undisputed ruler of this museum, that his opinion was the final word. He was holding a couple of documents that clearly had no real use for the work at hand. Lisa glanced at him, but didn't say a word. Over the past few weeks, she had learned to stay silent in his presence, accepting his constant criticism as something inevitable. He had become a shadow. His glances, his gestures, were now just part of the museum's fabric. "Are you still digging through these old papers?" George said tiredly, but there was more than just criticism in his voice. There was an underlying threat. He had noticed for some time now that Lisa was searching for something that could shake his prestige. But what was it? Lisa felt his gaze on her. It wasn't as harsh as usual. This time, it was more cautious, almost personal, though Lisa refused to let herself give in. She was used to it by now, and yet her response was firm, though respectful. "Yes, George, there's something I need to find. It's more important than you think." She didn't try to hide her determination. Perhaps her inner voice already knew she had to prove to him that she wasn't here by accident. Maybe everything that had happened in her life had been leading her to this moment. This artifact, this ancient history she was only beginning to unravel. It couldn't just stay a forgotten document in the archive. George sighed, noting her resolve. Lisa saw his face twist with irritation, and he stifled his anger before continuing. I thought we'd already decided what to do with this stuff, Lisa. These things don't matter anymore. We're not digging up things that belong to the distant past. We need to protect the museum's reputation, not give fuel to rumors. His words always sounded as though he cared about the team, about the building, about his place within it. Lisa knew it was just a desire to preserve the status quo, to keep change at bay, but she was sure that change was needed. This artifact could change everything. What they knew about the past, about the present, and even about themselves. But George wasn't ready for that. Still, she had no choice but to keep working with him. She couldn't let herself relax. She was still the newcomer, a woman whose presence in these walls always raised questions. The museum wasn't just a building with archives. It was a place where memories of slavery, of old times, of a world that had long passed, remained hidden, guarded fiercely. In that moment, Lisa realized the only way forward was to work with George. Despite his hostility, despite his views, which she felt were less his own than they were a reflection of this place, he was a product of a culture that continued to oppress her, as well as many other Black people in South Carolina. George was trapped in his comfort zone, and his beliefs often manifested in his actions, his gestures, his look toward Lisa, his silence when she asked a question he couldn't answer because he didn't see her. To him, she was just part of the decor. The work was slow and tense. With every step, Lisa felt how her presence on this ground seemed to disrupt a long-cherished harmony, like stones hiding water underneath. She was tired of fighting the system, her inner enemy, the man who always believed Black people should stand aside. George kept poring over the documents, and despite his openly expressed dislike, he couldn't deny her knowledge and persistence. He couldn't deny her drive to uncover the true history of the museum, though he saw her search as a challenge, as an interference in what had been unchanging and immovable in his world. The turning point came the day Lisa finally stumbled upon a document she suspected could change everything. Despite its age and yellowed pages, this document was a key piece of history that had influenced the museum's exhibits. Among the various artifacts, it mentioned the names of people involved in the liberation of slaves, in the history of resistance. This wasn't just a find. It was a revelation showing that the museum's history had been rewritten, that many of the artifacts displayed here didn't reflect the real past. She picked it up, but felt her heart tighten. George's gaze was heavy, full of confusion, and his silence was unbearable. This was what she had feared most, that she would uncover the truth, but those who stood behind the museum wouldn't let her move forward. Forget about it, George said, his voice sharp, but his gaze still fixed on the document she held. But Lisa could no longer retreat. She couldn't forget that only the truth could free this place from the lies it had been hiding. And she knew that this journey would demand even more effort, even more pain. But she couldn't stop now. After months of quiet clashes and tense moments in the museum's archives, Lisa finally realized that the artifact she had discovered was not just a key to forgotten pages of history. It represented something far more significant, a testament to the history of emancipation, one of the many stories the museum would rather leave in the shadows. This artifact, an ancient piece of metalwork, meticulously crafted by Black artisans whose work had long been overlooked in the light of historical stigmatization, was a direct threat to the museum's carefully curated narrative. The museum was one of the most prestigious in Charleston, but its reputation was locked within old stereotypes and naive myths about Black culture and heritage. The hidden archives Lisa had been studying contained unverified or distorted information about the contributions African Americans had made to the nation's culture. These findings had always been dismissed, buried in indifference or cold disregard. But Lisa, standing before this ancient artifact, knew the story had to be told in its full, unvarnished truth, not as the convenient version that suited the elite historians and curators. The artifact was more than just an object. It was an embodiment of human strength and dignity, a piece of art created by hands that had long been deemed invisible. It was heavy, exquisite, with rounded contours and adorned with motifs reflecting a culture that had been oppressed, but never destroyed. And this very artifact had become the bridge between those who had created it and those who now saw it as a threat to their power. Lisa knew her work at the museum wasn't just about cataloging and preserving the collection. She was here to tell the truth, to piece together the missing parts of history that didn't fit the politically correct standards. With each passing day, her conviction only grew stronger. And so, standing in one of the deepest, most forgotten corners of the archive, Lisa came across documents confirming that this artifact was part of a much larger, hidden context. In the archival records, she found references to how, over the years, the museum had deliberately concealed documents showing that many of the items in the collection had been made by slaves. The museum had systematically ignored this fact in its exhibits and publications. These records had been carefully archived and marked as unverified, a red flag that the museum was well aware of its own distortion of history. But what Lisa knew, and what she was about to uncover, was becoming dangerous. Not all the staff at the museum were ready for such revelations. Melissa Randolph, the senior archivist, was vocal about her doubts regarding whether it was worth pursuing this discovery. She was far too close to George Murphy, the old curator, who made no secret of his disdain for such findings. Though Melissa wasn't as overtly racist as her colleague, she instinctively felt that revealing this information would put not only the museum's reputation at risk, but her own career as well. George Murphy, as a true guardian of old traditions, immediately understood where this discovery could lead. He was deeply convinced of his own righteousness and wasn't about to let this young woman, uneducated and undeserving, overshadow the years of hard work and knowledge he'd built. He couldn't fathom how she, a black woman, could stand before him with such a challenge and attempt to disrupt the order he'd defended all his life. This only intensified the conflict between them. Throughout their work together, George constantly belittled Lisa's contributions. He looked down on her, made comments about her appearance, her manner of speaking, even her accent. These microaggressions were becoming more blatant. He dismissed her suggestions with a sneer whenever she proposed new ways to tell the story. The tension in the museum was palpable. Lisa felt the internal barrier she had to overcome. Though she maintained her composure and professionalism, the weight she carried became harder and harder to bear. She knew her successes would always be viewed through the lens of her race. At best, her work would be praised as an exception to the rule. At worst, she would be overshadowed, denied access to more important tasks because she didn't fit into their world. Finally, after weeks of internal struggle, Lisa decided she could no longer stay in the shadows. She gathered her evidence and prepared to come forward with her revelations, even if it meant risking her job. She chose not only to reveal her discovery, but also to expose how, for years, the museum had purposefully ignored crucial chapters of Black history. This step was not just a professional act, it was a deeply personal one, something she could not stop even if she wanted to. When she confronted George, her words were weighty and resolute, more than ever before. "The museum needs to admit its mistake," she declared, standing before him, locking eyes. But in his gaze, Lisa saw nothing but disdain and frustration. She understood that, despite all their months of working together, George still wasn't ready to accept her as an equal. Yet her words started to have an impact. Remaining true to her path, Lisa decided she would continue fighting for the truth, no matter his denial and the resistance from the staff. The fact that she had dared to go against a system that upheld racism became her first step toward revealing the real history of the museum. When Lisa Wilson, the young archivist, first stumbled upon the ancient artifact, her life at the prestigious museum in Charleston, South Carolina, changed forever. What began as an investigation into a mysterious exhibit soon set in motion a chain of events that rocked the very foundation of the museum, its reputation, and the relationships within its walls. By the time the truth about the museum's hidden history, its treatment of black people, and its deliberate ignoring of their role in creating many of the artifacts had been revealed, everything had changed. The museum, as though undergoing an identity crisis, found itself on the brink of transformation, and with it, the people who worked there. Lisa stood at the entrance of the museum, her hands slightly trembling, despite the confidence she felt when reflecting on her achievements. Nothing could bring back the atmosphere that had reigned here just a month ago. Back then, she had been the newbie, a black woman in the archive with no one behind her. Now her face was everywhere, on the front pages of local newspapers, on forums, in articles about the fight for truth and the recognition of black cultural contributions. Lisa understood that her life and work at this place had now become a symbol of not only change, but also the potential fracture within the museum itself. She still remembered how hard it had been in the beginning. Every glance from George Murphy, the old curator who embodied the museum's racist traditions, every cold gesture, every moment of underestimation, it all felt unbearable. George, despite his position as a senior and respected staff member, genuinely didn't believe that a black woman could bring anything of value to this cultural environment, one that had been steeped in whitewashed history, no matter how insignificant those histories seemed to him. He was a living relic from a time when foreign cultures weren't just ignored, they were erased from the official narrative. But now, with time having passed, there was more than just conflict between them. There was something that could almost be called understanding. Lisa, standing before the museum doors, felt how her life was changing with each new step. She was no longer the young, inexperienced woman she had been at the start. She had become a symbol of strength, faith in justice, and truth, no matter what others thought of her. Meanwhile, the museum was undergoing the inevitable consequences of its long silence and hidden misunderstandings. After Lisa and George had uncovered the secrets hidden in the archival documents that Lisa had stumbled upon, much had changed. The artifact, which symbolized the freed slaves in their contributions to history, had become the key to unlocking a forgotten yet crucial past. This discovery had shaken not only the museum's authority, but its very structure, because the museum, which had always tried to present history from a non-confrontational perspective, was now face to face with a reality that completely rocked its foundations. One of the key aspects of this revelation was that the museum, which had always claimed to uphold a neutral and wholesome view of history, had to admit that it had not only concealed its own role in distorting historical truth, but had also neglected the significant contributions of black people to culture. The artifact Lisa had discovered turned out to be much more than just a historical object. It was part of an entire culture that had been rewritten and overshadowed by the more prestigious white narratives. George, who just months ago had refused to work with Lisa, now felt the weight of his own understanding. He couldn't deny that the artifact mattered anymore. He sensed that his views on history and on the place of black people in it were beginning to unravel. Lisa had been his adversary, but she had also become the catalyst for change, forcing him to see the world through a new lens. He didn't like this feeling. He tried to distance himself from it, but gradually he came to accept that history, like people, was complex and layered. It was hard to say when exactly George had changed, but at some point Lisa noticed his views beginning to shift. Not all at once. Sometimes he would say odd things in an attempt to justify his old beliefs, but other times he just stayed silent, watching her with an uncertain look, as though trying to understand how everything had changed. At some point, their collaboration became less contentious and more constructive. George began to acknowledge that Lisa wasn't just a black woman in his archive. She was someone far more important, a person who could single-handedly tackle what he and his colleagues had failed to do for decades. But Lisa didn't let George forget what had happened. While she appreciated his efforts, she always remembered that behind him stood the very system that had tried to strip her of her dignity and respect. Melissa, another colleague of Lisa's, had become her quiet enemy. She, like George, had come to realize that things couldn't go back to the way they were. But unlike George, Melissa remained a staunch supporter of the old ways, hiding her dislike of Lisa, though never voicing it directly. Working with George hadn't been easy, and yet this experience had become truly transformative for both of them. The museum, like society, had been forced to confront its mistakes, and in that confrontation, though painful, it lay the path to overcoming old barriers and closed doors. The museum's staff, shaken by the discoveries, now had to accept these changes. It was a difficult process, but they began to update their exhibits, including new authors and cultures that had once been excluded from the official collections. At one point, after all the turmoil and effort, George approached Lisa and silently extended his hand. It was a moment of reconciliation, but perhaps even more, a moment of acknowledgement. Lisa, looking at his gesture, understood that something had indeed changed. It wasn't simple, but their worlds had become a little more alike. The new perspective that had emerged between them wasn't just the result of their work, it was a real turning point for both sides. George and Lisa were not perfect allies, but their relationship with each other had evolved. And while the museum continued its path of transformation, this moment became the first crack in the old wall of bias and ignorance, remaining a glimmer of hope for a future where equality and respect would be the guiding principles.